So to begin with, let's drop in a plane. Now, although I'm not going to be doing as much explaining in this tutorial, I am still going to elaborate on some things. Every tutorial I've made on my channel to do with cloth, just about, at least in the past year or so, has been to do with cloning cloth. We're working with one piece today, and that means that we need to sell it correctly, and that can actually be harder than you think. So we're going to make the size of this plane by 1,000 centimeters by 1,000 centimeters. We need this piece of cloth quite big, otherwise it's not going to look right. And what I want is the cloth to really whirl about on itself. And I'll explain more on that in a second. We're going to right click on this, simulation tags, cloth tag. Then we're going to do Control D. We're going to go to scene. We're going to take off the gravity. We're going to up our frame count to 150, and we're going to go to simulate forces turbulence. Now, let me set both of these to 50 as an example. Usually when you make a piece of cloth like this, and excuse me, as you can see here, there's no segments on the plane, so nothing interesting is happening. So change both the segments to 100 by 100. Usually when you put a turbulence on a plane or a piece of cloth, you're going to get something that looks a little bit like this. I want something much more energetic, much more heavy. So we're going to leverage a couple more advanced techniques and change a couple of parameters around and get something that looks cool. But the actual setup isn't that complicated. So, one turbulence. Let's set the strength to 100. Let's set the scale to 500. And we're going to leave that there. And now, this piece of cloth is going to be getting rippled on bigger rotations. It's going to be getting deformed more, and that's what we want. Like I said, I didn't want it just kind of looking like a flat plane with waves going through it. So let's duplicate that turbulence. We'll keep the strength, but we'll bring the scale down to 100, but we'll make the frequency, let's say 125. So if we turn off that first one and we look at the new one, you can see now that's more of our kind of waves. We could do a third one on a slightly lower strength. That's going to act as really kind of little waves. Maybe mess with them a little bit. And that could be useful later on. And then you mix them all together and we get the cloth flying about. But this is where it gets difficult. Is we want a plane modified by turbulences deforming this plane with a cloth simulation. But it just flies off screen. So this is kind of why I wanted to make this tutorial, because sometimes making these simple scenes can be a little bit more difficult than you think. An attractor won't really solve this. We just have to set the simulation up correctly. If we did use an attractor, it would just kind of ruin the effect we want. With that being said, let's keep making changes. Let's come into the cloth tag now. We'll go into the surface, the bendiness. As you can imagine, the bendiness does what you think the bendiness does. It makes it more bendy. So if we bring that up to 100, what we're really going to see from that is more detail, more pulling, more kind of thin lines across the cloth. But the fastest direction to that is to add more width and height segments. Think of this as resolution and detail when dealing with cloth. The more of these, the more detail we're going to get. And we're going to come up higher with that the further we go. So you can see just by upping that, we've got more detail. The issue is with the bendiness right now is that it can potentially cause the cloth to fold up on itself too much. And we don't want that. I want the cloth to kind of stay quite sprung out. I want it to stay kind of elongated. So that's where stretchiness comes in. So if we bring the stretchiness up to 10, and the stretchiness can kind of add to unrealism sometimes, but we're really going to work at getting this away. We want it to kind of stay centralized for the most part. So there's not really much other sentence I'm going to change here. I would maybe double the bendiness, and you'll see why later on. We might come back and change this more. But let's come to the damping. Let's override that. Let's set this to 10%. This is really going to slow the simulation down. It's like friction. It's like drag. This is really going to help keep things centralized for the most part. You would think that the mass helps with this as well, but I didn't really find that it did. Maybe slightly. You could put it at 25 just for safekeeping. Anyway, let's save this scene. So let's push this cloth to the place we want it to be. What if we were to go to 250 by 250? The simulation is going to get a little bit slower, but now we're getting the detail we want to see. We want these long kind of ripples all over the cloth. So you really just have to push into the trenches a bit. But if we do Control D, we go to simulation, let's double the sub steps. This is going to make it a little bit easier on us, but we're going to retain a lot of that detail. So you can see now, if I were to drop this in a subdivision surface, And we're not really going to use this subdivision surface because we're going to end up using a Redshift tag, but it's still good now to see the detail. What we've got here is something that looks quite cool, but we're going to take this in a different direction. Let's duplicate the plane. Take our first plane. We're just duplicating this in case we want to come back to it. Let's make this plane editable. Go to polygonal mode. Select them all. Right click, extrude. Change the offset to 2. Make sure create caps is on and hit apply. And the reason we're doing that is because we're going to add some ballooning. Not too much. We're just going to thicken it up a little bit, make the cloth feel heavier, add a bit more detail. And we need thickness for that to work. So let's change the overpressure to 10. Let's change the expansion time to 45. We really don't want too much ballooning here. And I'll explain why. If I attempt to play through this, it's going to be a bit slower now. What you see now after adding the ballooning is there's smoother parts to the cloth. And this is what the ballooning does, is because it's expanding parts of the geometry, which is going to pull more of that kind of like turbulent detail that we're used to seeing in favor of expanding parts. So the result we're trying to get today, we want to kind of stay in the middle between the two. We don't want to pump up the overpressure and have this blow up like a balloon. We don't want it so small that it stays like a thin piece of cloth. So we want it kind of in the middle. This will also help and stop the cloth from flying about all over the scene. This is going to keep things a little bit neater. And if we were to just add a Redshift camera, change it to like 200 on the focal length, and pop this at the center of the scene, and we've got some clipping there, so we can do Control D and go to Project, Display, go to View Clipping, change that to Huge. Let's turn on the subdivision. You can see we're already getting something that looks quite cool. But just for safekeeping, in case the cloth decides to fly away, let's add in a sphere. Come back to object mode. Make the sphere just bigger than our plane. Add a collider. Put the bounce all the way up to 10. Put the friction to 0. Change the collider side to both. You can just turn that off. We'll save again. And now, hopefully, the piece of cloth will not fly all the way out of the scene because it will just bounce off the sphere. So that's pretty much it for the cloth setup. What we're going to do now is we're going to cache this, and once it's cached, we can Alembic retime it and find a couple of cool frames and then go straight into Redshift and make some cool renders with this heavy piece of cloth. So you can see here, this is really the kind of look that I want. We've got some nice ballooning and parts of it really thickening up, and then we've got nice thin folding parts. So let's get straight into caching this. So we're going to make sure the subdivision surface is off. Even you can actually pull the plane out of that now. We're not actually going to use it again. We're going to go to the cache and we're going to cache this object. Or you can just cache the whole scene actually. Maybe delete that cloth tag off the first plane just in case it messes with anything. And I'm only saying that because I've had a couple of weird instances making these where previous cloth tags have interrupted and deformed newer pieces of cloth I've made, even though the other ones have been turned off. Quite weird. Don't know if it's a bug, but best to do that to stay safe. So we've got really small setup here, a couple of turbulences, damping, so we don't really need any friction or anything. Let's just cache the scene. And once that's cached, and we can play through this now and see it's super quick. And this is what I like. I want the cloth super spread out. I don't really want it crunching up into a ball. Kind of does it slightly towards the end. But for the most part, we're good here. What we're going to do here is just convert the scene cache to an Alembic, and that's going to give us the ability to time remap. I think this is new in Cinema 4D 2025. I haven't seen this before in the cloth tag. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this is new. This is similar to what's in the new particle caching in the new Cinema 4D particles, where the Alembic is just built into the cache, which is really useful because it saves us having to export it out and bring it back in. So we can just convert the scene cache to Alembic. And now what we can do is give that a little bit of a retime with these splines here. So we can slow that down, have it super wavy, like it's underwater. You could even do like one of these cool Instagram animations you see, where it sort of goes really fast and then slows down again. Maybe that's a bit too fast. Something like that. Okay, so I think we're in a pretty good spot here. What we can do now is jump into Redshift and make a couple of cool renders with this. So what's kind of interesting and irritating about this cloth is it just sort of floats about, which makes finding the composition a bit difficult. Plus the axis is wherever it sort of wants to be. So we can't rotate this around now, but we can't center the axis, and we just have to move the camera around a little bit. Drop in the Redshift render view, and let's hit render. And we have our cloth. Looks amazing like that, doesn't it? I'm going to come up to 2560 by 1440, and we're going to right click on the plane, go to render tags, Redshift object, override in the geometry, enable this, and now we're subdividing directly in Redshift. We can just rename this plane now as well. Cloth. Turn the turbulences off. Group all them. Call them sim. Keep the scene a little bit neater. Let's just drop in a area light. Now if we press F2 or middle mouse click, if you press F2 it'll take you directly to the top view. Then we go cameras, perspective. We'll do NA on our keyboard. I'm going to remove the word plane. Now we can just move about here and stay in the camera. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in a null. And that's because I don't want to target the cloth because the axis is at a bit of a strange position. So we're just going to move this null, call it target, and then right click on the area light animation tags target that null. Zoom out here. And now we're just kind of, our light's hitting more of a center point. And we'll go back and forth a little bit with the lighting, but generally, similar to my last couple of tutorials, the last couple of days during the Christmas calendar, keeping the lighting quite simple, we're just going to do 2 lights on each side. Maybe one a little bit lower. And we've got some work to do here with the composition. So if we play through here and have a look at the cloth. Like I mentioned, we can rotate this. I'm not entirely sure how much. I like the way it looks right now. We'll get a bit closer. I think this should work. It's just we're seeing this big patch here that doesn't really have any detail. So if we were to rotate it, we can maybe just come forward a bit. That could potentially help. And maybe have one light coming from the back a bit more. Make it a bit taller. Something like this for now. I feel looks pretty good. Let's drop in a Redshift dome light. Turn it off in the viewport. Go to the object. Make it black. What we're going to do is turn off the background. We're going to duplicate it again. We're going to make this one white. We're going to turn on the background on this one. Make sure they're both turned off in the viewport. Go to details, but on this new one, the white one, turn off all these sliders here. And now this one can be our background, so you can rename that background. And this one is basically controlling our shadows. As you can see here, I could lift the shadows up a little bit just so it's not so dark underneath the cloth. And then from here, I would say we could make a material. So let's make a material. And I'll show you a couple of things I did with the material as well to make it pop a bit more, add some cool nuances to it. I'm going to control click any of those dots and get into the material. And immediately let's just double click and add a color. Plug that straight in. And just for now, let's go for a blue. Crank up the roughness. I'm going to bring down the reflection. I want kind of a similar material to what I would use when I would do those like swirly cloths, where it's just kind of a nice simple color, but a little bit see-through. So we'll add some transmission, and we'll bring this up to maybe about 0.4, 0.5, somewhere in the middle. But we're just going to duplicate that color holding control, drag this over the material. Base properties, transmission, color. So now we've got that color on the back of the transmission as well. And you can make this a bit of a darker color. That'll look quite cool. As you can see here, if we were to crank up this transmission, bring down the roughness and bring up the reflection, you get this really, really cool look here. But I don't really want this today. So go back to where we were. give it a bit of extra roughness there as well. And this is more of sort of the material I want. I wouldn't mind a bit more transmission showing up. Something like this I'm feeling pretty happy with. Still don't know how I feel about the actual composition of the cloth and where it's situated right now. That just takes a lot going back and forth, and that's kind of hard to achieve in a tutorial, especially when I'm trying to keep this tutorial very point to point. Took me probably about 4 or 5 hours of playing, and I wasn't even necessarily playing in Redshift. I was just messing with the simulations until I was getting formations that I liked. Let's come to the Redshift settings and go to the color controls. Let's add a bit of contrast there on these curves. And I'm gonna drop in my LUT. But I'm gonna bring the strength of that way down. Don't want too much. And then in the camera, let's go to color correction, tone mapping. Can mess with some of the highlights, mess with the saturation a bit. And already we've got a pretty nice render. Before we go any further with the material, and before we take any other directions, I'm going to duplicate the camera. I like to turn off my cameras in the viewport, otherwise so I don't have like lines going everywhere, because it gets a bit annoying. And I'm going to mess with a couple of close-ups here. So let's see what potential angles we can get. Closer up to the cloth. Something like this is cool, but I'm not overly sold on the lighting position there. That's cool, but this side kind of lacks detail. Yeah, this looks quite cool. I'll just make a couple more. Yeah, something like that. Really cool. Awesome. So yeah, this is quite a simple tutorial, but it's actually quite tricky at the same time. You know, we've just got a plane, we've just added some turbulences, but sometimes they can be harder than you expect to get right. If we jump through here and see what happens, and we come to the cache as well. You know, if we were to speed that up, we can see some of the later positions it may take on itself during the animation. See if there's anything there that we like. See, that has potential. Maybe just push that a little bit. Okay, so I think I like this a little bit more. We can just recenter that. You can maybe even drop the focal length too. That'll help with the scale of it, make it feel a bit bigger. And I may even want to rotate that back a bit more again to add a bit more depth to things, you know, so it's not just so flat. But then that's probably going to call us to mess with the lighting. And usually when I'm lighting these, I kind of like to turn off one light and just move off of one so I can see what each light's doing. See, that looks really cool. And then we can work in the second light. Maybe go underneath. How do they look both on the same side? Pretty cool, but we're missing a lot of potential in the middle. Maybe come around the front more. Yeah, so now we're kind of padding the cloth on each side with lights. That looks really cool. Pretty happy with that. Again, something I'll probably come back and change. Check those close-ups again now because they're just going to be different. This angle is still holding strong, so I'll keep that. This one I will move. That's looking quite cool. Let's stop playing with things because I'm just going to go back and forth for ages. And let's add a little bit more here. So one thing I did to kind of boost the detail and the feel of the render. See, now I'm looking at this lighting too long. I don't like it. I'm not going to get caught up with it though. I used something from Grayscale Gorilla, the power chord. I don't think it really matters which one you drop in, but I would drop that in and then have to change it to nodes. If we come into this material And I'll come down here. And I just grab like the height and the bump. And Control C. And bring this into my material. Plug those into the bump and the displacement. And then I would grab a float. And I'd plug that into the general UV remap scale, and the same on the height. And this is a bit funny, actually bringing up the number reduces the scale, so I think somewhere around 45 is where I was at. And that just adds like these cool lines on it. You know, bit of texture. Makes it look a whole lot cooler, a whole lot more professional. But we would have to go to the Redshift tag and turn on the displacement. I wouldn't bring this above 1, otherwise you'd start to see weird artifacting over the cloth, especially on higher polygon count. I think 1 is just enough. In fact, we are even getting it there. So the other way around that would be to go into the height and reduce into the displacement and reduce the scale to like 0.5. See if that gets rid of it. There's still a little bit, maybe do 0.2. So in terms of materials, that's literally all I did. I didn't really do anything else, except once I did that, add that bump map and stuff, I added a bit of metalness. That helped things just sort of pop a bit more. And then I would experiment with different colors too. Let's see what colors I liked, which direction I wanted to go. I think for now I'm going to stick with some sort of blue. I'm going to mess with the lights one more time before I move on to some final details we can do to this simulation. I would kind of want more shadows in some places. It feels too illuminated right now. You can always duplicate that light and leave that first one kind of as a save state and have a little look at what we can do just by moving that around more. I really like that coming in from the back. That looks really cool. Especially there. And then we could make another one. So this would be like a second line setup to see, I suppose. Maybe put this one down below there. I think that maybe pops a little bit more. And I mean, we can add a third light. I mean, I like to light really minimalistically, but you know, we could get some highlights on the edges there or something. So that looks really cool, but probably a bit too much going on for me. I kind of like there being some shadows. For the most part, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much the render. Really simple, but we're gonna mess with a couple more things now to see what else we can do. Drop the saturation a bit, you overdo it. I like dropping it because then you get more contrast. We could actually drop that background a little bit out of white. We could come down to like a grey. Don't think it has to be that white. And if we duplicate this camera, let's see how this looks on a even smaller focal length. Get up close. Yeah, a couple more tweaks. I went further back in the timeline. Kind of like how it looks here. Getting a couple of dead pixels, which is a bit annoying. It's usually the maleness that does that. This looks really cool. There's some lack of detail in some areas, but again, that's really just like the positioning of everything. You know, you spin something and you take it a different way or whatever, and you can hide a lot of that. See, this entire bottom side is just got way more going on. I'm probably just going to go back to where I was, but this is cool to see. I'm just going to stay where I was for now. A couple of little things I did to add more detail. One of them was a cloner, and then adding in a cube. And you set these cubes to about 3 centimeters, maybe 2 centimeters. Put the cube in the cloner. Change it to object, multi-instance, and just put the cloth in the cloner. Bring up the count to about 50,000. And then if you add a random effector to the cloner, turn off the position, mess with the rotations, maybe mess with the scale a little bit. Let's drop this down to 1 centimeter. So now we've covered the cloth in these cubes. And just like I've been doing in my particle tutorials the last few days, jack up the reflection. Make it a bit whiter. And jack up the roughness. And these are a bit too big and a bit too visible now, but if we make them actually about 0.7, we should just be able to get these nice little sparkles all over it, which again looks really, really cool. And if we go to some of these close angles now, and we were to, say, focus on a part of the cloth, and then go to the optical and turn on bokeh and drop this to about 0.4, I'll get these really, really cool shots. You can add a bit of vignette in. Not that much though. And then let's bring that down a little bit more. Make that shot way more contrasty, bring the blacks a bit. Yeah, some really, really cool shots like this. Go out to this wider camera angle we made. Do the same thing. And we want this cloth to feel quite big from a distance, so I wouldn't use any aperture on these angles. And then this angle too. Quite like this one before. Let's focus on this. And add the bokeh. 0.5. See what we get. Looks pretty cool. Probably not as strong as the other angle, but still pretty cool. Nice little sparkles everywhere. So yeah, this also turned out to be quite a strong angle now. One last thing I'm going to show you is some cool little particle trails coming off of it. I'm actually going to keep the cloner on for this. I'll turn it off just while I'm making it. Really, really quick particle setup. Let's grab an emitter. Make it a mesh emitter. Then emit from the cloth. Let's emit 500,000 particles. Let's put this in the particle group. Go to the particle group. Draw radius 0.001. If you want to know everything I'm explaining right now, go back to my previous 2 tutorials from the Christmas calendar over the last couple of days. You will learn everything that I'm doing right now. And then from that, let's grab a data mapper. Let's take the age of these, make them, keep it on 30. Take the radius, make this about 0.1. Have them hit their peak really early, fade off really fast. And then let's add a turbulence. Do what we did in the tutorial from a couple of days ago. Make sure you go follow that if you want to learn some cool particle stuff, where we're just going to stack these turbulences on top of each other with different radius, with different strengths. And in the particle speed, let's drop this to about 25. And we're on frame 105 right now, and if we just play through this, I believe that should be enough. You see we get all these particles spawning in, and they fly off. And they're dying off as well. And then let's drop in a cube. Put this in a null. Make it 1 by 1 by 1. Add a redshift tag. Or sorry, add the redshift tag to the particle group. Go to custom objects. Drag the cube in there. Put that same metallic material on the cube. This might not look perfect first round, but we'll give it a playthrough, see if it looks. We should get all these nice, cool, flaring particles. So let's make the cube a bit bigger. So we'll probably just have to run this back one more time. I don't know if the scale of them is coming off potentially too quick. We probably won't need the cloner on now for this. Looking at it. So we have a look at the data mapper. Let's just like increase the age quickly. Oh, and do you know what would help as well? Actually, I know what it's doing. I went over this in my other tutorials, and I've still done it. Is when we use the data mapper, we have to set the radius to 0. Set this back to 30. There was literally something I stopped in my tracks the other day and said, make sure you do this, otherwise it's not going to work properly. And I've just went and done it. I mean, what we're making right now is probably a little bit more optimized for stills, because in those first few frames, the particles are not catching up with the motion of the cloth, which is making them look a bit weird. Now let's up the size of them, see how that looks. Cool, so now we get like all these particles flying around the cloth. It's just a little bit, the particles aren't doing enough. So because of the movement of the cloth, the particles are going to need a bit more scale, a bit more strength. So we'll give them that. And there's so much you could do with this. This is just like a really little thing on top, you know. I mean, I could go on for... Now we're seeing a bit more movement from them. This is just a little bit at the end of the tutorial to see what we can do. But there is a lot you could do here with follow splines. You could really hash this out, make this into something incredible. But just in a little 2-3 minute segment, see what we can get. I think that looks awesome. And if we have a look at some of these close-ups, it looks cool as well. But I would probably reduce the particle count, to be honest. I don't think you need that many. So let's just do it once more on something like 200,000 instead. But yeah, just a couple of little effects. You can do it with the cloner, you can do it with the particles. And this is so awesome now that we can do all of this just in Cinema 4D. We're not using any other plugin, we're not doing anything. The most I've used is a Grayscale Gorilla material. It's just bizarre. It's really wild to me that we can just do all of this right now. Now it looks a little bit better, a bit cleaner, not so muddled up. And that's some particles. I personally prefer the cloner. I think the cloner looks a little bit better. And you can see here in a couple of my stills, I did one where this was with the particles spawning on shot, so they were just spawning on frame 1, and then kind of taking their own movement, and then that was allowing me to run more turbulences through them to the point you could actually see what was going on. And then this is more of the effect that we've just done here, but I've spent a bit more time kind of dialing it in. So you can see you can get some cool stuff from it, and then we've got, you know, these normal sparkles. I'm going to leave this here. I just wanted to make a nice simple cloth tutorial. It's something I hadn't done. Just a nice simple piece of cloth on its own. And I often find that when I'm tasked to do that, and I come across it quite a lot, especially in freelance work, and oddly enough, when I am tasked to do it, sometimes it's just a pain, man. Like, you just wouldn't think that like a piece of cloth on its own is difficult, but it can just be really annoying. So I wanted to make a tutorial on it. I had to wrestle with it a lot to prepare for the tutorial as well, just to make sure that, you know, these are the parameters I need to put in. And that's what forced me down that path, really, was because this is very easy just to keep going back and forth with it, because the result is entirely unpredictable. You're really only working with your turbulences, and you just kind of want to get some shape and deformation into the plane. Hopefully there's better ways to do that. I mean, I don't know of them, if there is. If, you know, I mean, there's some things that come to mind, but the more simplistic side of me is just like, well, I should just be able to put some turbulences on it and get what I want, which is what we've done. You can get some really, really cool renders out of this, but you've just got to be prepared for how tedious it is. The result you might get from your turbulences might not look the way you want it to look, and then you've kind of got to keep going back and forth with it. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed the little bits on the end, just having fun with it as well. Much more simple tutorial today. There'll be much more advanced stuff coming again in the next couple of days. More particle stuff coming, bigger and better stuff. I'm really having to mix and match this up to make sure I get enough tutorials out, but also that they're all high quality and all providing something. And this was one that was kind of sitting at the back of my mind for a while, so I'm glad I got around to it. I'll see you again tomorrow for another tutorial, and make sure you go check out my Patreon, check out the tutorials from the last couple of days, and I'll see you tomorrow for another tutorial. My Patreon is a place where I can make tutorials that are a lot more in-depth than YouTube. Things that don't always suit the YouTube algorithm. Breaking down all the different parts of my workflow, how I light things, how I apply materials to things, and the various different parts of my workflow, looking at client work, looking at breakdowns, looking at my scenes in general, and often doing a lot of repetitive tutorials over and over to really build up that workflow so we can get good at 3D. So sign up to my Patreon today and see exactly what my true 3D workflow is all about.